We got 5 minutes on the clock. What is your name and what is your podcast show?
My name is Sean Simon, and the podcast is the Martech Matrix.
The Martech Matrix. All right. So, with building your podcast show, why did you build it and how does it support the business functions of what you guys are building?
Yeah, we found that different people like to consume content differently, and that just writing a blog about marketing technology wasn't enough. And some people wanted to be able to listen while they were going for a run or in their commute. So we wanted to find other ways to connect with our followers, right? So people that were interested in learning about marketing technology, but just didn't want to spend the time reading the articles that we were writing. So we thought, what better way than to create a podcast?
Yeah. So, when you guys started, what was one of the biggest failures you guys had? Looking back, you're like, I wish we didn't do that in the world of podcast creation.
Yeah, I think it's probably similar to most people, which is just because you're recording a podcast doesn't mean that they're going to show up. So you need to have a really strong social media presence that makes sure that your content's being shared, so that people subscribe to the show. Make sure your content's available on as many channels, if not every channel possible. So I think at first we thought we would just make a podcast, and then I realized most of my time is actually spent promoting the podcast than it is actually recording the podcast.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? If you build it, they will come, right? Kevin Costner says
Yeah.
that. Doesn't always work that way. What have you found to be one of the greatest rewards of having a podcast show for you and your business?
Yeah, I have a specific example. I was on a call with a client, a member of our community in the coaching collective, and he said he was interested in one of our solutions that we represent at Cogent, that he had heard about on our podcast. So I was like, I don't think we talked about that. And he goes, No, I heard about it on the podcast. And I thought, okay, perfect. This was the entire purpose of the podcast. I don't know how many times that's happened. He's the only one that's fessed up to it, but it was rewarding to hear that for sure.
Yeah. Isn't it funny that, a lot of times people are like, "Hey, I heard you on the podcast, or I listened to your episodes," and you're like, "Wow, I sometimes as a podcast host, I have no clue who's listening because sometimes it feels like a one-way conversation." And then when they say it, I'm like, "Wow, all of it was worth it because I just closed a big deal or relationship."
Yeah, for sure. I had people I'll be on a call with just catching up, and they'll be like, I heard this on your podcast and it taught me so much, or I learned so much listening to your podcast. And I make it so that they can get it in a really quick way. I always tell people, listen, I'm going to tell you exactly what the show is about in the first 30 seconds, what business problem this guest is trying to solve for with their company. If you don't have that problem, hang up, shut the phone off, whatever you're listening. Don't listen. I don't want to waste your time. I don't want you to think of me as somebody who wastes your time. I've listened to podcasts waiting for that aha moment, and it doesn't come, and I'm just like, I'm done. Like, I don't even want you to listen because if you don't have that problem, it's not going to resonate with you. And I'd rather have you come back or listen to another episode.
Yeah. So, do this. What was one of your greatest moments in podcast or one of your worst moments in podcasting?
Well, one of the worst moments was certainly having a dog bark right behind me. He's cute, but it can make for an annoying conversation when the dog's barking behind you. So he's no longer allowed in the room when I record. God, the best. I think the best is when actually it was probably the last episode that I published, which would have went live last Monday. Um, I didn't go with a script. I decided I know this guy. We've worked together in the past. I know he's really smart. He's taught me a lot. And when we work together, I'm just going to have a conversation with him. And if it's one of the shorter podcasts, that's okay because I know it'll be succinct. And it ended up going as long as every other podcast. And it might have been the best podcast episode because it was just natural. There was no script.
Why do you think it went so well?
I think when you know the material, when you know what you're talking about, it's easy, right? I also think, because for us it was episode 22 or 23, I think I'm just more relaxed doing it right now. I'm more confident that I can work through any silences. But there just wasn't any with this guy, and we could just keep going. We probably could have kept going, another hour. But I think it's just a matter of making sure you're prepared for the podcast, making sure that you know the material enough that you don't have to count on your guest to carry the conversation.
So, 4 seconds left. Where can people go to listen to your podcast show?
Yep. The martechmatrix.com.
Awesome. Fellow podcast hosts and creators, as always, reach out to our guests and say thanks for being on the show. Their contact information will be in the show notes below. If you have a podcast show or a YouTube channel that you'd like to talk about here on Podcast Host Army, head on over to podcasthostarmy.com, fill out a quick form, maybe get you on the show next. Till then, talk to you all next episode.